This is Tiny, a mini STX based computer sporting an Intel Core i5-6500, 2.5-inch SSD and 4 gigs of RAM. All that in a custom, handcrafted cube case with an edge measuring a little under 20 cm. Spoiler alert, Project Tiny is not suitable for gamers since the mini STX platform is missing a PCI Express slot, but this idea can be easily adapted for a mini ITX system with a proper GPU. And yeah, I know it's not exactly tiny. I started from creating a very minimal frame for the motherboard and the SSD. I took an angled aluminum bar, measured and marked first bending point, extracted triangular piece of material using hacksaw, and modeled a 90 degrees bend. Did the same thing 14 centimeters further and cut off the rest of the profile. Next, I placed the motherboard onto the frame and marked the mounting points. Then I drilled holes for M3 threaded inserts, which I fixed in each opening, and moved on to making room for a 2.5-inch SSD. I laid the motherboard onto the frame and put the heatsink onto the socket to establish an appropriate height of the entire contraption. Speaking of the heatsink, for this build I used the Arctic Freezer 12. A somewhat compact design with 3 heat pipes making direct contact with the CPU. What's cool about Freezer 12 is that it's a semi-passive unit. Dense fins create enough surface to passively cool the CPU under light workload, with the fan kicking in when the CPU temperature exceeds a certain threshold. I placed the SSD and established the height of the mounting assembly. I cut a piece of flat aluminum bar and another shorter piece of an angled profile and attach one to another using rivets. I marked 2 mounting points and drilled holes for the screws. Then I bolted the assembly to the frame with 2 rivets. Next, I cut a 4 cm long piece of angled profile that will be used to attach the frame to the case. I put both in the vise and drilled a hole using 3 mm bit. I made a hole on each side of the other arm so I can later screw this part into the wooden case. Then, I enlarged the opening using a 4 mm drill bit and fixed a threaded insert. Before moving on to woodworking, I assembled all components together to establish exactly how big the case should be to fit the cooler. Using short motherboard spacers, there was a clearance issue with the frame and the heatsink mounting bracket. I could have used taller spacers, but decided to modify the frame. So, I marked the bracket outline, disassembled components, and removed some of the material with a file. Next, I cut 18mm plywood at 45 degrees using miter saw. I know I'm a terrible carpenter, but this doesn't stop me from trying. And woodworking in an apartment is quite challenging, so I think I deserve some credit. Anywho, after cutting 4 sides, I cut a piece for the front and sliced it diagonally at an angle using a jigsaw. I'm sure there's a better way to do that, but I think I still did an okay job. Next, I glued the box together and attach the front pieces. To ensure sturdiness of the contraption, I drilled pilot holes and put in a few screws. Then I filled all the cracks and covered the screws. And once the filler has dried, I sanded down the surface, preparing it for applying veneer. But just before that, I stained some of the plywood on the front that will remain exposed. Next, I cut 4 pieces of veneer, applied glue to both surfaces, and after waiting 10 or so minutes, I put both together and applied pressure. After the glue has settled, I cut the excess of the veneer using utility knife and sanded the edge with 80 grit sanding paper. Unfortunately, I misaligned one of the corner pieces and I had to fix that mistake. I tried my best to salvage the veneer, but didn't quite succeed. So I had to cut another piece and glue it in place. With the front ready, I proceeded with putting veneer on the outer surfaces. The drill was pretty much the same. After applying glue and waiting 10 minutes, I carefully aligned the veneer with the front and applied pressure. Then I cut off the veneer on the side and at the back. Sanded down the edge and moved on to applying veneer on another surface. An hour later, I was pretty much done. Then I cut some steel mesh from the front and the back, the only difference being that the latter piece was cut a bit shorter to preserve access to I/O ports. I cut 2 small pieces of wood and glued them in the back as the mesh cover support. I sanded down the surface and applied wax all around to achieve this rich texture and matte finish. Before putting everything together, I connected power switch and fixed it to the I/O port at the back with double-sided tape. The final assembly was as easy as sliding the frame in, securing it with an M3 bolt, and replacing the back cover. The Core i5-6500 makes Tiny a solid productivity workstation in a compact package that doesn't look like a computer at all. The Arctic Freezer 12 does a great job keeping the CPU cool at 30 degrees while browsing the web, with the temperature hitting 55 degrees under full load, but even with the fan at full speed, Tiny remains quiet. I'm really pleased with how this build turned out, with its only issue being just 2 USB ports, both at the back, but this is something that can be easily solved with a hub. I'm considering selling Tiny on eBay, and there will be a link in the description if I decide to part with it. This is it for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.